The house smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner, the sort of everyday comfort that had anchored 1,000 ordinary mornings. I walked inside expecting the usual. Trevor's baseball cap tossed by the back door, the kettle still warm on the stove, Angela humming in the kitchen. Instead, the hallway felt wrong, too quiet, like a room that's been holding its breath. She sat on the edge of our bed, the light from the window catching the silver at her temple. Her hands were folded around a small printed sheet, fingers white where she gripped it. Trevor was downstairs, practicing a sliding drill in the yard, oblivious. Angela's mouth moved before her eyes found mine. There was a tremor in it I hadn't seen before. "Jared," she said, and the name came out thin. "We need to talk." The words should have been a warning. They were not. Shock has its own logic. It hushes a person's voice and sharpens a person's senses. I sat across from her on the bed, watching the tremble of her knee, the way her lower lip quivered when she swallowed. She handed me the sheet. A scan, a doctor's note, neat clinical lines that betrayed nothing and revealed everything. It said, plainly, that the dates did not align. My first reaction was disbelief, that tight, animal reflex to reject anything that upends a structured life. I read it twice, then a third time, as if repeating would dissolve the letters into something less true. But the numbers stayed the same, unforgiving and precise. Conception dates, measurements, technical language that left no room for a convenient misread. I felt the room tilt and had to steady myself on the mattress. "Are you sure?" I asked. It came out small. People who have built things, buildings, companies, reputations, measure twice, cut once. The data had the same clarity. She said, "The doctor said he ran it 3 times," Angela answered, voice cracking. Tears pooled suddenly, a spill that had nothing to do with the sterile clarity of paper. She avoided my eyes. Guilt and fear were quick, honest things across her face. For a long time I said nothing. Anger in novels arrives like a tidal wave. In life it's often a slow, acid bloom that eats at you from the inside. Memory supplied me with little details that had seemed trivial before. A cologne on a scarf that wasn't mine. The way her stories of running errands had become oddly specific and then oddly vague. The borrowed excuses about staying late for charity work that never had a name attached. None of it was proof. All of it was a net that now held more weight. I collected the obvious, her phone, face down on the dresser, a receipt peeking from under a stack of mail in the kitchen, a hotel loyalty card she claimed belonged to a client. I didn't confront her with fury. Confrontation is a tool when you want immediate resolution. I wanted truth, and truth likes evidence. Angela's hands shook as she tried to explain. Fragments tumbled out. Regret, panic, a plea that made her words crumble. "It was a mistake," she said at one point, as if the phrase could shrink the world back to what it had been. "I'm sorry." The syllables were small, exhausted. I listened, cataloging the sincerity of her voice against the clinical impersonality of the paper. That evening I walked the house like a man familiar with blueprints and hidden cavities. The dining room light threw long bars on the floor where a faint perfume lingered by the chair she usually used. Her makeup bag, unpacked, a smudge on the zipper, contained an extra lipstick shade I had never seen. In the glove compartment of the car, I found a parking ticket stamped at an address I didn't recognize. Timestamped 2 weeks ago on a night she said she'd been at a woman's book club. They were small things, and small things can be lies if repeated enough. Trevor came in late that night, boots muddy, cheeks flushed from running. He asked about pizza for homework, talked about a grounder he'd made at practice. He hugged me without knowing anything had broken on the other side of the wall. I held the hug longer than usual, feeling the warmth of it like an anchor. I realized then that treachery does not always ruin everything in a single sweep. Sometimes it corrodes patiently, eating at the seams until a life begins to fray. I didn't sleep. When I did, it was in short, jumpy scraps, dreams where Angela was smiling at a photograph that blurred when I reached for it. Wakefulness came with calculation, not yet strategy. Little things I could learn without alarming her. The day would not be for declarations. It would be for watching, for notes, for discreet confirmation. Over the next 2 days I watched closely but quietly, adopting the neutral routines of a man who had to keep his business running and his son's life steady. I sat in the truck outside a cafe for an hour one morning, watching faces through the window, seeing how Angela moved through a room, her posture, the tilt of her head when she smiled at an unknown man. I listened to her voice on the phone during a call and heard a warmth I had not heard reserved for me in years. The little clues stacked like timber. I hired silence as an ally. I did not accuse. I let the paper, the receipts, and the looks speak for themselves. There is power in patient observation, in allowing the facts to assemble without the distortions of rage. That patience is not weakness. It is the prelude to clarity. By the end of the week, there were more patterns than possibilities. Names appeared on a scheduling app she claimed she never used. Photos surfaced on social feeds that were private at a glance, but open at the edges. A hotel confirmation matched the parking ticket from the glove compartment. The triangulation was not perfect, but it leaned heavy toward a truth that would not be ignored. I sat in the quiet of the house one midnight, drink untouched on the kitchen counter, and watched Angela sleep in the next room. We had shared a bed for 15 years. I had seen her at her most exhausted and most radiant. Seeing her now in the vulnerable, unadorned way that sleep renders a person made the betrayal ache differently. It was not only the act, it was the intimacy sold in secret, the sameness of our life used as cover. I had not made a plan. That part of me, the builder, the man accustomed to drawing plans and executing them, was only beginning to stir. First, there would be certainty. First, there would be a full accounting. First, there would be decisions about what to tell Trevor and when. First, there would be a reassembling of facts into a story that could not be disputed. Somewhere in the hollowed space of that night a resolve formed, not a blueprint for revenge, but a promise to myself. To know before I acted, to act with the same integrity and precision I demanded of my work. Revenge, if it came, would not be a tantrum. It would be a consequence, measured, unmistakable, and final. As dawn found its way through the curtains, Angela stirred and reached for me sleepily. I turned my face toward the pillow and let her hand rest on my arm, light and familiar. The skin of her fingers against mine felt like a question. What now? I didn't answer. There are moments when silence is a strategy. Outside, Trevor's bike creaked as he rode away to a new day. Inside, the house held its breath. The first chapter of something terrible had closed, but the story itself, how I would respond, what I would surrender, and what I would not, was just beginning. I told myself the work would steady me. That was half truth. Work did steady me, but not because the projects needed me right then. It was because numbers and schedules had a logic I could trust when people did not. I slid into my routine like a man changing into armor. Calls, site checks, emails. But under that armor lay a nervousness that felt like an insect under skin. Constant, impossible to ignore. I called Chuck first. We'd been partners since high school. He handled numbers, I handled the field. He answered on the second ring, voice warm with easy familiarity that felt both comforting and dangerous. Comforting because it was normal, dangerous because if the normal slipped, I had to be the one to carry everyone through. I told him I had a personal thing to sort out, but didn't give details. Chuck's tone changed from banter to concern and then back to business, an unspoken promise to shoulder what I needed to offload. The next day, I met Paul Hines in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso and paperwork. Paul was a short man with the kind of eyes that missed nothing, an ex-detective who had traded a badge for discretion and fees. I had found him by referral, someone who collected facts like rare coins. I laid out what I knew, slow and measured. He nodded, listening like a man assembling a jigsaw puzzle without yet seeing the picture. I don't want drama, I said. I want certainty. If there's a pattern, I want it documented. If there's nothing, I want that too. Paul's laugh was a dry click. I don't do drama, Jared. I do evidence. Give me access to her public accounts. Let me watch movements. No breaking in, no entrapment. Just observation and digital preservation. If there's a thread, I'll pull it. I felt a curious relief at his words. Watching felt like responsibility rather than spectacle. He recommended a digital sweep, recover deleted messages, check cloud backups, examine location tags. He'd plant no cameras in private rooms. That would be a line I wouldn't cross. The line mattered, even if anger wanted to erase it. We agreed on parameters. Things had to be legal, undeniable, and presentable. Paul left with a list and a promise. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pen, something nearly ritualistic about handwriting plans when your life felt typed in bold font. The list read like a ledger of betrayal: receipts, timestamps, hotel names, emails, parking tickets. I wrote Trevor's name at the top and underlined it until the ink bled, a private anchoring, a reminder of what I couldn't lose in the noise of what I might do. Over the next week, I became two men. There was the public me, tight suits, contracts, clients who needed calm. And there was the quiet me, coffee cups left half drunk, evenings spent scrolling through lines of metadata, nights awake cataloging patterns. When I wasn't at the office, I trailed habits that were almost domestic rituals of surveillance: checking the glove compartment for receipts, scanning trash for hotel tabs, noting timestamps on her calendar that didn't correlate with the story she offered. The first real break came from a careless taxi receipt. It had my wife's name on it, destination, downtown, 11:42 p.m., a Thursday marked as a dinner in the calendar she'd shown me. Dinner with whom? She had said a woman's book group. The receipt said otherwise. Paul turned the taxi receipt into a timeline that, when stacked with parking tickets and a hotel reservation, began to look less like coincidence and more like choreography. I didn't confront Angela. Not yet. Instead, I told myself that discretion would yield better architecture for whatever came next. Confrontation, raw and immediate, would scatter any possibility of repair or retribution. I needed room to consider outcomes for Trevor: school stability, emotional fallout, what to say and when. Children are not collateral. They are the gravity that keeps you from reckless orbit. One late afternoon, Chuck dropped by the office with 2 coffees and a question he'd been carrying for days. He'd noticed distance in my emails, a clipped tone in my calls. He leaned on my desk and said, "You've been different. If something's up, I can cover whatever you need. Take a week if you have to." I wanted to tell him everything, but the truth felt like a live wire, dangerous to touch. Instead, I gave him a half-truth that shifted responsibility without betrayal. Family issue. Need to keep Trevor steady. I'll handle it, Chuck. But I might need you to front a few things if I'm called away. He nodded, eyes searching mine. There was loyalty there, thick and solid. I owed him honesty, but honesty in that moment would have been a loaded gun. I decided then to let him in, but in pieces, the professional fragments first, the personal ones when they were safe to hold. Partners deserve respect, not shock, and Chuck's steadiness would be a lever I might need. Paul delivered results in small, deliberate packets. Deleted messages resurrected from cloud caches, photos that had been temporarily hidden but synced in places Angela had not thought to lock. There were timestamps, late nights, mornings that said coffee but matched a hotel checkout time. Geolocation pings that placed her at an address I hadn't known. One photograph was the hardest, blurred in a way that made the subject recognizably intimate but not explicit. It didn't show the act, it showed the intimacy: an arm draped over a shoulder, a laugh caught in midair. It was the sort of proof that did not scream adultery so much as whisper its existence in cold, convincing detail. I felt something like nausea reading it, a stomach turn that had nothing to do with the concrete facts. Betrayal carries a smell, not literal but perceptual, a sense of being cheapened, of time sold in parts. I did not rage, I cataloged. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched Trevor's bike light fade down Maple Ridge. The boy waved as he passed. I kept my hand pressed against the cool rail until the outline disappeared. He was the axis on which my decisions would turn. There were practical matters too. I consulted, briefly, with my attorney. Nothing official, a hypothetical conversation about custody and asset protection in the abstract. Jeffrey was a safe sounding board, discreet, pragmatic, and incapable of drama. I didn't file anything yet. I wanted options, not actions. I wanted to know the lines I could draw and the paths to take. Meanwhile, Angela's behavior shifted in small, telling ways. She began to watch me watching. A comment left unsaid, a glance that landed too long on my face then darted away. She'd call me during the day with excuses that sounded practiced, and then breathe with a fragility that was either guilt or a convincing mask. Whatever it was, she had access to only a fraction of my awareness now. I lost sleep over the ethics of what I was doing. Privacy is a porous thing once mistrust takes root. The urge to dig can become its own vice. At times I wondered if I had already become the sort of man I would despise: obsessive, petty, a pursuer of secrets. But each time the thought surfaced, I would picture Trevor's face, his lunchbox on the kitchen counter, the scuff on his baseball glove, and the sharpness would dull to the honest ache of protection. A week in, Paul called with a new piece, a hotel folio showing consecutive stays that coincided with dates Angela had told me she was home. It was the kind of item that could be verified with a phone call by anyone with enough cause. I sat with the folio for a long time, the paper cool against my palms. The rational part of me cataloged the consequences, financial entanglements, the damage to reputation, legal levers we could pull. The fearful part of me saw Trevor's eyes on my face and begged for mercy. That night, I put the folio in a drawer and made dinner like a man performing a ritual he no longer felt. I set Trevor's plate in front of him and watched him eat, the ordinary scene of fragile film over the fracture beneath. Angela busied herself with clearing the table, smiling in a practiced way that did not reach her eyes. For a moment, something like pity flickered through me, at the absurdity of two people living on a house built of the same bricks and occupying different blueprints of loyalty. I would not act yet, not because I lacked fury, but because fury without clarity is ruinous. There would be a reckoning, but it would come on my terms, calculated, fair to what I cared about, and precise enough that no one could mistake it for cruelty. For now, the work was observation, and observation was a way to keep the small, irreplaceable things safe while the larger thing sorted itself into truth. In the dark, as the house hummed with artificial calm, I wrote down a single note and slid it into my wallet. Protect Trevor. Know before you act. It was less a plan than an oath. The quiet reconnaissance had revealed enough to destroy a lie, but not yet to close the book. The chapters ahead would require patience, and patience, I reminded myself, had always been part of how I built things that lasted. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the kind of quiet that made even my own heartbeat feel intrusive. Trevor was still asleep in his room down the hall, and Angela was in the kitchen, pretending to sip coffee while scrolling through her phone. I watched her for a moment, noting how her thumb moved with an unconscious rhythm, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked up at the sound of a creaking floorboard. Every detail mattered. Every micro-movement told a story. I decided to start small, verification, not confrontation. Paul had begun sending reports via encrypted email, and the first one held a thread I hadn't anticipated. A hotel receipt from the Grand View Hotel, time-stamped in the early hours of Tuesday morning. The guest name was Angela Moody, obvious, careless, but the folio also included an additional charge for a second occupant. This was the first concrete indication that someone was with her, someone not supposed to be there. I didn't tell Angela I knew. Instead, I maintained the pretense of normality, pretending to be absorbed in contracts, making calls to suppliers, walking the line between routine and suspicion. I even asked her about dinner plans for Trevor's baseball team, and she responded with vague but polite enthusiasm, betraying nothing. She was careful now, aware, but the digital breadcrumbs were unavoidable. By mid-afternoon, Paul delivered more, a series of photos showing Angela leaving the hotel late at night, entering the same black sedan repeatedly. License plates were flagged, timestamps verified, and the man she met was partially visible in some frames. A tall figure, dark hair, clean cut, a suit that screamed deliberate impression. He was her anchor, her co-conspirator, and though I didn't yet know his identity, I now had a target to trace. I spent the evening cataloging everything, writing down each date, each location, cross-referencing with her supposed work meetings and friend lunches. Patterns emerged. Twice a week, usually after 10 p.m., she would vanish for several hours, returning with excuses that made sense only superficially. The lies were sophisticated but not airtight. Even now, as I documented the details, I felt the familiar edge of anger. Not blind, flaring anger, but precise, sharp, and ready to strike when the time was right. Trevor knocked on the study door, his small hand on the frame. "Dad, can I help with the timeline thing?" he asked, genuinely curious. I looked at him, feeling the swell of protectiveness. I smiled lightly, ruffling his hair. "Not yet, buddy. This is grown-up stuff. But I promise, when the time comes, you'll know everything you need to." His eyes lingered on mine a second longer, trust reflected there, and I realized why patience mattered more than anything else. That night, I sat in the dim light of the study, reviewing Paul's surveillance and piecing together what I began to call the pattern of deception. Every new piece of evidence felt like a small victory. A parking stub here, a GPS ping there, an email left open that hinted at secrecy. Angela's world, carefully constructed, was beginning to unravel under the lens of quiet observation. Then came the breakthrough, a series of text messages recovered from her cloud backup. They were cryptic but undeniable, endearments not meant for me, planning notes for meetings, references to our plan, and next week's escape. My stomach tightened at the words. The emotional betrayal landed differently than the logistical evidence. It was personal, deliberate, and calculated. I didn't explode. I didn't call her out. I stayed calm, documenting, organizing, and preparing. There was power in silence, and I intended to wield it like a scalpel. Every photograph, every receipt, every digital trace would become a tool in the strategy one was beginning to form. By midnight, the outline was clear. Angela and the man, who I now knew was named Marcos Jennings from a casual cross-reference of his email addresses, were engaged in a long-term affair, meticulously orchestrated around my schedule, around Trevor's routine, around appearances in Cedar Falls. This wasn't a mistake. This was architecture. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of realization settle. My marriage, my life, the stability I had built, it had all been undermined methodically. And yet, even in that crushing knowledge, a strange clarity emerged. I wasn't going to lose everything. Not because I could control people, but because I could control how I responded. The quiet reconnaissance had paid off. I had the thread. The next step, I decided, would be to weave it into a net. Not for anger, not for spectacle, but for precision. For justice. For protection. For Trevor. And as I closed the laptop, the house silent around me, I realized that the real work, the careful, deliberate, unflinching work, was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke with a purpose that felt almost physical, a weight pressing forward, demanding action. Trevor was still asleep, the faint hum of the heating system filling the house. Angela had already left for a supposed charity brunch, but I knew better. Every absence, every excuse, now had its own meaning. I didn't confront her yet. Confrontation without control was wasted energy. First, I needed certainty. Not suspicion, not fragments of evidence, but complete clarity. Paul had begun digging into Marcos Jennings, background checks, financial trails, social interactions. By late morning, Paul sent me a preliminary report. Marcos was exactly the type of man I expected. Handsome, polished, superficial charm, but with inconsistencies that screamed arrogance and carelessness. More importantly, he was married. Twin daughters. $1 million home. Public persona immaculate. Private life corrupt. I smiled thinly, feeling the first real spark of strategy ignite. Angela had chosen a partner with a perfect veneer, confidence, wealth, and visibility, but a deeper look revealed cracks, and I intended to exploit every one of them. Step one was protection. I couldn't afford mistakes, not for Trevor, not for the business. I called Jeffrey Dunn, my longtime attorney. Jeffrey, I said calmly, I need a complete corporate restructuring. Everything shielded, house, accounts, investments. I want the prenuptial clause enforced. I want airtight protection from this woman's manipulations. Jeffrey's voice was measured, as always. We can do it, but you need to move fast. Once she senses something is wrong, she'll act, and you'll want contingency plans. I know, I said. Start today. While Jeffrey began his work, I turned my attention to Angela. The plan was methodical, observation, verification, and gradual escalation. I had to know the full scope before making a move. That evening, I arranged a casual dinner for Trevor, ostensibly just the three of us, though I knew Angela would insist on inviting herself. She arrived with her usual charm, smiles, light conversation, but I noticed subtle things. The way her fingers tapped the table, the quick glances at her phone, the half-smile when she thought I wasn't watching. Every movement was a breadcrumb, and I was tracing them. After dinner, Trevor went to his room to do homework. Angela lingered in the living room, sipping wine. I stayed calm, collected, making notes mentally while letting her believe everything was normal. Busy day? I asked casually. Yes, she said, voice bright but strained. Just some errands, meetings, you know. I nodded, eyes steady. You're staying on top of things, good. Her smile faltered slightly, the mask slipping for a heartbeat. I didn't comment. Instead, I excused myself to check some emails in the study, where Paul's latest update awaited. The images confirmed my suspicions. Angela and Marcos had been meeting twice a week for months. Time-stamped photographs, hotel folios, and text messages made the timeline undeniable. I realized something crucial. The affair wasn't just about lust. It was strategic, planned, almost clinical. Angela had mapped her absences around my projects, around social events, around Trevor's schedule. They had been meticulous. I made a decision: slow, deliberate escalation. First, I would gather the absolute maximum evidence. Then, I would protect assets. Finally, I would strike, legally, socially, and personally. Each move calculated, precise, inevitable. That night, I didn't sleep. I reviewed photos, emails, receipts, and notes. By 2 a.m., I had a working map of their interactions, locations, times, and potential witnesses. Every thread I followed brought clarity and a sense of empowerment. I was no longer a man in the dark. I was a man constructing the narrative, the net, the trap. By dawn, Trevor was up. I joined him in the kitchen for breakfast, smiling genuinely. "Ready for your baseball practice?" I asked. "Yeah, Dad," he said, bright-eyed. "Can you come watch today?" "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, masking the storm beneath. As I drove Trevor to practice, I glanced in the rearview mirror, thinking of Angela and Marcos. They were confident, careless, and completely unaware. And that, I realized, was my advantage. Confidence paired with ignorance is always exploitable. By the time I returned home, Paul had another set of documents ready: bank transfers, hotel bookings, and encrypted communications. The puzzle was coming together. With each piece, the strategy became clearer. First protection, then revelation, then dismantling their lives in a way that was permanent and unavoidable. Angela returned from her brunch, unaware I had been working all morning. She moved through the house, organizing, chatting, playing the part of the devoted wife. But I was no longer seeing her as my partner. I was seeing her as a component in a larger system, a system I intended to dismantle piece by piece. The chapter of deception was long, but the chapter of revenge had begun, and I was writing it with precision, patience, and unshakable resolve. I started thinking like an architect again, the sort of thinking that imagines load-bearing points and weak seams, then plans reinforcements or removals. Only now the structure I examined was human: reputations, finances, alliances. If I wanted irreversible collapse, I needed to undermine the supports that kept Marcos and Angela standing. First, containment. I called Jeffrey and asked him to draft emergency measures that would protect the business and Trevor. "We're not filing yet," I told him. "We need to be invisible until the moment we're not." Jeffrey understood. He set up a layered defense: temporary business entities, revised account signatories, and a clear paper trail in case someone tried to launder assets or move things offshore. It wasn't glamorous work. It was the sort of invisible labor that won courtrooms. Second, evidence hardening. Paul's reports were good, but evidence must be presented in a way that survives cross-examination. We needed chain of custody, witness statements, and corroboration. Paul coordinated with a digital forensics expert to preserve metadata and backups in an extrajudicial vault. Every file was time-stamped, hashed, and duplicated. I wanted the truth to be immovable, a thing that could be laid on a judge's desk and not be dismissed as conjecture. Third, leverage. Marcos's public life was gleaming: investors, publicists, philanthropic events. Those connections were his pride and vulnerability. I hired someone with a media background, discreet and merciless: Elena Rivers, who'd worked crisis management for politicians and corporations. She did not take pity. Her first suggestion surprised me: "We don't scream. We whisper strategically." The plan was to turn his public world into a pressure cooker: slow leaks to the right reporters, paired with legal complaints that force audits and freezes. The goal was not just to punish, but to make his facade crumble first, so the rest would follow by momentum. While those pieces were set, I ran my own quiet investigations into Marcos's projects. I visited 2 of his construction sites under the pretense of a routine inspection, camera in my jacket, list of questions prepared. He was there, fit, practiced smile, the kind of man who makes you feel small without trying. I watched his foreman avoid eye contact with me, watched crews patch up corners with hurried hands. In one back office, I found a binder with loose invoices, lines that didn't add up, suppliers paid twice on adjacent pages. Not yet proof of felonies, but enough to make an auditor curious. That evening, after Trevor's practice, I sat with a beer on the porch and watched the town I'd built a life in. People walked dogs, waved. To them, I was Jared Atkinson, successful contractor, father who coached Little League. The duality felt surreal. I had to keep one life intact while dismantling another. It required discipline. I started small public maneuvers, filed a few anonymous tips about possible environmental violations at one of Marcos's satellite sites. Not incendiary allegations, just enough to prompt an inspection. I knew bureaucracy. A single inspector's report could ripple into contractors pulling permits, investors getting nervous. At the same time, Elena seeded a quiet rumor to an investigative reporter she trusted. Rumors about a developer spending more than his ledgers showed. The reporter asked the right questions. The questions get others talking. Talk makes mistakes. Inside the house, Angela grew thin at the edges. The once confident woman who hosted charity boards and smiled for cameras now flinched at the ring of the phone. She blamed stress, pregnancy, the public's expectations, but stress has textures I'd learned to read. Her hands moved faster when she thought no one watched. She cleaned with frenetic energy that made the house hum. Once, Trevor caught her looking at a small dress she had bought, fingers tracing the fabric as if composing a future speech. For a moment, she looked undone, not by fear of being found, but by the weight of a plan that was no longer entirely her own. One night, Elena called with a plan I had not considered. Involved Samantha Jennings, Marcos's wife, quietly, before anything public. She's sharp, Elena said. She dotes on her twins, but she's a lawyer. Betrayal hits hard. If she sees evidence, she'll move faster than anyone. The thought of bringing another woman into this felt like throwing a stone into a pond. Ripple consequences I couldn't fully predict, but Samantha was not the enemy. Marcos was. I wanted his entire structure to be judged, not just the affair. Paul arranged a meeting between me and Samantha in a coffee shop that tasted of lemon and civility. She arrived poised, carrying herself with the coolness of someone who'd been trained to hold ground in a courtroom. Her eyes hardened when I explained, and she asked for proof. I handed her a binder, photographs, receipts, timestamps, the folio of hotel bookings. She read in silence, not breaking for coffee, not showing a flicker of drama. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "We'll move fast, Mr. Atkinson. For the kids. But you understand the complications. I need more than emotion. I need documents." We shared a common cause in that cramped shop, two people who'd been manipulated, though our motives were different. She wanted justice for her children. I wanted reparation and protection. We forged an alliance built on a pragmatic axis, a woman with legal power and a man with resources. It was a quiet, dangerous partnership. Back at home, I oscillated between domestic normalcy and clandestine engineering. Trevor's math homework, dentist appointments, weekend hikes, those were anchors. I kept my stoicism not because I had hardened, but because haste would ruin precision. I found myself lying to Angela in small ways, about late meetings, about who I'd had coffee with. The lies felt strange in my mouth, but necessary. Deception to counter deception. As the pressure on Marcos increased, inspections at 2 sites, a quiet inquiry into accounting, I noticed a change in him. He retreated from public functions, canceled a gala, avoided the charity board. Confidence gives way to paranoia quickly. Men like him either implode or lash out. I watched for both. Then, one late afternoon, a small, jagged piece moved in my favor. An assistant at Marcos's firm, careless and bitter, leaked an email thread that hinted at off-the-book payments. It wasn't a smoking gun by itself, but it gave Jeffrey an opening to request formal audits and subpoenas through channels that wouldn't immediately link back to me. The legal machinery began to turn. I stood in my study that night, watching lights blink on in houses across Maple Ridge, and felt the momentum shift. My actions were not theatrical. They were methodical, almost surgical. I had not become a monster. I had become an instrument of consequence. He who had built his life on illusion would find those illusions audited into oblivion. Still, there was a humane part of me that held back the final blow. I refused to weaponize Trevor's innocence or expose every intimate detail to public spectacle. There are edges you do not cross if you want your life to remain salvageable. I reminded myself of that line often. Mercy, in small doses, would make the eventual victory clearer. As the week closed, I received a call from Elena. "Traffic starting," she said. "We have a reporter poking at his developers. The EPA has flagged a site for inspection based on an anonymous tip. His bank has frozen a recent transfer pending clarification. Keep your phone close." I set the phone down and walked to the window. Angela's car was in the driveway, her silhouette momentarily visible through the blinds as she moved from room to room, unaware of the quiet avalanche she had set in motion. In the distance, distant sirens, routine, unaware of the privately staged chaos they would soon amplify. I lit a cigarette, not because I wanted to smoke, but because I needed the ritual. The smoke curled and disappeared into the cold night, much like the lies I had been carrying for weeks. Only these lies would not simply vanish. They would be turned into accounting, audit trails, indictments, and, ultimately, consequences that matched the magnitude of the betrayal. The traps were set. They were not traps of violence, but of truth, of legal pressure, and of social unraveling. I had learned how to build structures to withstand storms. Now I was learning how to dismantle someone else's foundation, brick by careful brick. And as the first tendrils of public scrutiny began to curl toward Marcos, I felt the satisfaction of seeing a plan, patiently conceived, finally begin to work. The morning the avalanche began, the town still smelled like rain and cut grass. I had gone to bed with a mind full of figures and woke up to a world that had shifted underfoot. My phone buzzed before I could reach for it. Elena's name on the screen, terse. "Watch the news." Now, on the local station, a tidy package about developer Marcos Jennings ran with a tone that felt like polite curiosity until the anchor read the lead. "Investigations into environmental violations and alleged financial misconduct at several Jennings development sites are underway." The segment rolled footage of inspectors in hard hats walking through one of his projects, foremen with ducked heads, and a statement from an anonymous source about discrepancies in billing. The camera scanned a manicured face for a woman I recognized, Angela's. She was in the background of a charity gala clip, smiling in a way that now looked brittle. For a minute, I watched like a man watching a blueprint catch fire. Interested, terrible, inexorable. Elena's voice returned to my phone. "They're asking hard questions. His PR is scrambling. Expect calls." They came in the predictable rush. Calls from reporters, from Jeffrey about subpoenas, and from Chuck, steady, concerned. I answered Chuck by stepping outside, the cool air a pinprick of clarity. "They're starting to audit him," I said. "We need to be careful with timelines, but keep an eye on our public posture. No statements, no leaks from us." My moves were surgical. Elena orchestrated a small leak to a state-level investigative journalist who had a reputation for following paper trails into corners that officials preferred left dark. The journalist began connecting dots. Permits inconsistently filed, suppliers paid at odd intervals, environmental assessments bearing faint inconsistencies. Meanwhile, Paul forwarded me a trove of documents that made the connections between Marcos's off-book accounts and the lifestyle I had watched on social feeds. Expensive dinners, private flights, and a pattern of payments to entities registered in shell names. The legal machine word. Samantha Jennings, cool, practical, and furious, moved faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, she filed for emergency measures, asset freezes, and temporary custody protections for the twins. Her filings were precise and surgical, written in a language that left no room for theatricality. Marcos's lawyers found themselves on the defensive, and the first tremors of panic rippled through his office. Investors called meetings. Board members scrubbed records frantically. Marcos called me once, voice tight like it was trying not to break. The man who had smiled so easily at charity dinners now sounded like someone who had been braced for impact and found it worse than imagined. "Jared," he said, "this is a misunderstanding. You don't have to." I let him finish and then said, quietly, "I'm not the one who filed complaints." The silence that followed was the sound of someone realizing they were falling. "But if this is a misunderstanding, you should make it right. With your family. With your business." He stammered. Emotions pried at the surface. Fear, anger, then a thin veneer of control. The call ended with excuses and promises I knew would evaporate under pressure. I put the phone down and felt a small, almost clinical relief. This was not the moral satisfaction of vengeance. It was the practical movement of consequences. At home, Angela's behavior unspooled visibly. She who'd hosted luncheons and shaken hands at fundraisers now walked the house with the look of someone monitoring a collapsing bridge. Her fingers hovered over her phone like a pianist waiting for a cue, and when it rang, she moved away to whisper. The shades of color in her face were new, pale, then flushed, then pale again. Once, I caught her standing in front of Trevor's bookshelf, fingers trailing over the spines, as if deciding which memory to hide and which to save for later. Trevor watched us both like a weather system reading a barometer, uncertain, alert, and fearful of the forecast. One afternoon he asked me, with the bluntness of children who have not yet been taught the ritual of polite evasions, "Is everything okay with Mom?" His face held that small, chiseled-line children where when they try to hold themselves steady for adults. I crouched, put my hands on his shoulders, and looked him in the eye. "We're figuring things out, bud. You're my priority, always." He nodded, small and trusting, and I felt the gravity of the promise humid and binding in my chest. The media tide intensified. A national outlet picked up the local reporting and ran with it, pairing it with footage of Marcos's glossy developments. The word embezzlement appeared in the headline of a blog with a national reach. The dominoes tipped. Banks issued temporary holds, partners tightened contracts, and crucially, one of Marcos's larger investors announced a freeze on further capital infusion pending a full audit. That evening, I sat in my study as Jeffrey mapped legal pathways across my desk. "You did well to stay out of this publicly," he said, "but prepare for countermoves. He'll try to discredit sources, attack chain of custody, and play the injured husband. If he's cornered, he'll lash out." "He's not the only one who can lash out," I said. My voice had a hardness to it I hardly recognized, like the sound of gears locking into place. Jeffrey nodded. "We'll ready a response. Not a spectacle. Facts." But even with the legal scaffolding, the human elements were messy. Angela cried more often now. Grief no longer polished into an acceptable sadness, but raw and poorly contained. We had the same roof, the same kitchen, the same bed we pretended to share, but the architecture of our life felt like it had been gutted and someone was redecorating in secret. I watched her from a safe distance, closer than I felt comfortable, further than I felt generous, wondering when, or if, she would speak honestly. Then came the first public fracture. Marcos, in a televised interview intended to reassure investors, did not hold his composure. His charm slipped into petulant defiance. He admitted only to minor accounting errors and invoked stress and workload. The anchor's follow-up questions were colder. The interview looped on the evening news, and friends who had once nodded at him with admiration now looked at him through the lens of doubt. That night, after the interview, I drove to the Grand View Hotel under the thin excuse of meeting a potential client, an excuse that would have sounded absurd before all this, and sat in my car, watching the valet stand idle and the polished lights reflect off the wet pavement. I thought about the architecture of lies and the way they fracture under pressure. I thought about consequences I had set in motion and how far they would reach. When I returned home, Angela confronted me in the hallway, breathless and ragged. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question a knife edged with accusation and pleading. The vulnerability in her voice was naked, shame mixed with fear. "Doing what?" I asked, though I knew. Her lip trembled. "I can't keep living like this," she said. "You don't have to ruin him. You can stop it." I looked at her and felt both pity and contempt. "This isn't about ruining anyone for sport," I said. "It's about consequences. Truth has costs." My words landed in the narrow space between us. She pressed her palms to my chest, searching for something, mercy, perhaps, or a trace of the man she once knew. The contact felt fragile, like glass. Inside, a machine was moving, auditors, reporters, lawyers. Outside, the town hummed, unaware of the personal commotions behind closed doors. The avalanche was not a single shout, but a slow cascade that started with a whisper and ended with an excavator of truth. I had lit the first sparked ember. Now the cold work was letting it burn through what it needed to. Before bed, I wrote a short note and left it on Trevor's desk. "We'll get through this. I promise." I hovered over it for a long moment, hand pressed flat to the paper, feeling the warmth of the pencil print like a talisman. The promise felt heavier than any legal filing. The avalanche had started, and it was ruthless, but my priorities, as ever, were not about destruction for its own sake. They were about establishing a future where the boy in the next room could grow without being rearranged by other people's betrayals. The days after confronting Angela passed in a strange, almost surreal haze. Jared went through the motions at work, attending meetings and inspecting construction sites, but his mind was always half elsewhere, calculating, observing, planning. Every interaction with Angela was like walking on a thin wire stretched over a canyon. One wrong word could snap everything into chaos. Angela tried to act normal, but the cracks in her composure were impossible to hide. She would glance at him quickly, eyes darting away when he looked back, and spend long periods on her phone, whispering in hushed tones that made him tense with suspicion. Trevor, unaware of the storm brewing at home, continued with his baseball practices and weekend projects, blissfully naive. Yet Jared noticed the tension behind his son's laughter. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Cedar Falls skyline, Jared lingered in the garage long after Trevor had gone to bed. The smell of sawdust, oil, and wood shavings was comforting, grounding him in a world he could control, unlike the one Angela had destabilized. He ran his hands over the half-built birdhouse on the workbench, remembering the weekends spent with Trevor constructing these little projects together. It was in these moments, surrounded by simple, honest work, that he found the clarity he needed. His plan began to form like a blueprint for one of his buildings, methodical, precise, and unyielding. He couldn't act on impulse. This wasn't a one-day construction job where mistakes could be fixed the next morning. This required patience, surveillance, verification, and strategy. He would gather proof, document every interaction, every meeting, every trace of Angela's betrayal, and then execute a plan that left no room for retaliation. The first step was surveillance. Jared contacted Paul Hines, the former detective he had used for small, discreet investigations before, and laid out the situation with calm, calculated precision. "I need you to follow Angela without her knowing," Jared said, his voice steady but edged with restrained fury. "I want her movements documented, her meetings recorded, every transaction noted. And I want it done professionally. No mistakes, no assumptions." Paul agreed immediately, understanding the gravity of the case and the meticulous planning it would require. Within a few days, cameras were in place, logs of Angela's movements compiled, and every meeting she had with her mysterious companion, Marcos Jennings, documented. Meanwhile, Jared kept up appearances at home. He didn't yell, didn't confront Angela, didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing he suspected the truth. He watched, noting every detail. The way she pretended to organize the nursery while texting frantically. The way she insisted on visiting her sister, but never came back with shopping bags. The casual, dismissive tone she used when he tried to engage her in conversation. Every observation became a brick in the foundation of his plan. He took meticulous notes, compiled schedules, cross-referenced phone records, and began to anticipate Angela's next moves. By now, the betrayal was no longer just an abstract thought. It was a living, breathing entity in his house, weaving tension and deceit into every corner. One Thursday evening, Jared decided to test his theories. He casually mentioned to Angela that he might leave early for a business meeting in a nearby town. Her reaction was subtle, but telling. A flicker of panic, a quick glance at her phone, a slight hesitation before nodding. He knew then that she had been lying about her whereabouts, and that Paul's surveillance had likely captured the proof he needed. Jared felt a cold satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from control. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, he knew he had the upper hand. He was no longer just a man blindsided by infidelity. He was a strategist, a tactician, and every move he made was part of a careful orchestration that would eventually expose Angela and Marcos without leaving any chance for their escape. He went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling a mixture of anger, determination, and clarity. The plan was taking shape. The evidence was solidifying. And the moment of reckoning, when the truth would finally unravel before their eyes, was drawing closer. The next morning, Jared rose early, before the sun had even touched the Cedar Falls skyline. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. Angela was still asleep, curled under the duvet as if the morning had no power to demand her attention. Trevor was at a friend's house, giving Jared the solitude he needed to focus. He poured himself a black coffee, the bitter taste grounding him, sharpening his mind for what had to come next. Jared opened his laptop and pulled up the surveillance files Paul had compiled. Photographs, timestamps, location data, all meticulously organized. He scrolled through images of Angela slipping into a luxury hotel, exchanging hushed whispers and quick glances with Marcos Jennings. Receipts for expensive dinners, hotel stays, and unexplained purchases flashed across the screen. The trail was undeniable. Jared's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew this was only the beginning. The evidence needed to be used strategically, with precision. He started a separate folder, Plan of Action. Each step was outlined like a construction project, complete with deadlines, contingencies, and desired outcomes. Every detail mattered. Step 1. Confirm identity and frequency. Paul's surveillance had shown enough, but Jared wanted to ensure that every meeting, every exchange, every secret communication was documented beyond doubt. Step 2. Protect assets. He drafted emails to his attorney, Jeffrey Dunn, to restructure financial holdings, safeguarding everything from the family home to Trevor's college fund. Step 3. Set traps. Jared knew he couldn't act recklessly. He needed Angela and Marcos to reveal themselves fully, to demonstrate their arrogance and overconfidence. By mid-morning, Jared received a message from Paul. They're meeting tonight at the Grandview Hotel, Suite 912. Marcos arrived 15 minutes ago. No sign of Angela checking in yet. Jared felt a twinge of satisfaction. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He spent the afternoon preparing, going over every possible scenario, anticipating their actions and reactions. By the time the evening arrived, he was ready. He parked a discreet distance from the hotel, observing the entrance. The valet moved with mechanical precision, unaware of the tension in the nearby black SUV where Jared sat reviewing photos one last time. Soon, the elevator doors opened and Angela stepped out, flawless, smiling as if unaware of the consequences that loomed over her. Marcos followed, carrying himself with the same arrogant confidence Jared had come to despise. Jared remained hidden, his presence undetected, as they entered the suite. From his vantage point, he could see the suite's windows reflecting the city lights, their bodies silhouetted in casual intimacy. He didn't interfere yet. This was about documentation, proof, and psychological advantage. Within moments, Angela removed her coat, revealing the expensive dress Jared had noticed in earlier surveillance. Marcos leaned in, whispering something, and Angela laughed, a sound that used to make Jared's chest tighten with warmth, now twisted with betrayal. He snapped photographs, careful to capture the expressions, the touches, the unmistakable evidence of intimacy. Then came the key moment. Angela pulled out her phone, typing messages with intense focus, and handed it to Marcos briefly. Jared's heart pounded, not from passion, but from the power of knowledge. Each piece of evidence added weight to the impending revelation. He waited for over an hour, until their movements suggested a sense of comfort, a belief in their secrecy. Then Jared left, blending into the night, knowing that the next steps were legal, financial, and devastating. The foundation was being set for the collapse that would follow, every action calculated, every consequence anticipated. By the time he returned home, the house was silent. He poured another coffee, feeling the cold determination settle in his chest. This wasn't revenge born of rage. It was precision, strategy, and inevitability. Angela and Marcos had set the stage themselves. Jared was merely the architect of the truth. And soon, the structure of their lies would crumble entirely. The following morning, Jared sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight slicing across the countertop in sharp lines. The house was eerily quiet. Trevor had left early for baseball practice, and Angela was nowhere to be seen. He opened the first envelope of evidence Paul had handed him, arranging the photos, receipts, and message logs neatly in front of him like blueprints. Every detail mattered. One overlooked piece could give Angela or Marcos a chance to slip away. He picked up his phone and dialed Samantha Jennings. The call connected immediately. Hello. Her voice was cautious, professional, but Jared could hear the tremor of concern beneath it. Samantha, it's Jared Atkinson, he said, keeping his tone calm, calculated. I have something you need to see. It's about Marcos. There was a pause. Go on. I have proof of an affair between him and my wife, and that they are planning to leave both families for each other. I need to meet with you in person, coffee, whatever's convenient. You deserve to know everything before any decisions are made about your daughters or your husband. She exhaled slowly. This is serious. When can we meet? Now? I'm nearby. I'll be brief. Within the hour, they sat in a small, quiet coffee shop near her law office. Samantha's eyes scanned every photo, every hotel receipt, every time-stamped message. Her composure was remarkable, considering the storm that had just landed on her life. They've been planning this for months, Jared said, letting each word sink in. Angela and Marcos assumed they could escape with everything. My assets, your husband's life, and leave the rest of us in ruin. But they underestimated preparation and precision. Samantha nodded, the wheels in her mind turning. You're right. The documentation you have, it's airtight. He won't see this coming. Jared leaned back, watching her process the truth. Exactly. And we're going to make sure it stays that way. I've coordinated with my attorney, protecting everything. But we need to act fast. Timing is critical. Over the next hour, they formulated a coordinated plan. Samantha would immediately file for divorce, secure emergency custody of her daughters, and freeze Marcos's assets. Jared would trigger federal investigations for environmental violations, tax fraud, and any other criminal activity Marcos had exposed to him. Everything had to happen simultaneously. If either Marcos or Angela had time to react, they could attempt to hide evidence or manipulate outcomes. By the time they left the coffee shop, a silent pact had been made. The next 48 hours would be a controlled storm, carefully executed and impossible to escape. Back at home, Jared poured himself a strong black coffee. The bitter taste a reminder that this wasn't personal revenge, it was justice executed with strategy. He opened the laptop again, checking the schedules, reviewing the evidence one last time. Everything was in place. Angela returned home that evening, unaware of the web closing around her. She smiled faintly, casual, as if nothing had changed, but Jared's calm gaze met hers like steel. He said nothing. Words weren't needed yet. The trap had been set, and soon, the dominoes would fall. Angela woke the next morning to the usual sunlight spilling across the bedroom, but the atmosphere felt different. A strange quiet hung in the house, almost ominous. She moved through the hallway with careful steps, avoiding creaking floorboards, and found Jared in the living room, laptop open, coffee untouched, eyes scanning the screen with sharp focus. He didn't look up when she entered, but she sensed something had shifted. Morning, she said cautiously, testing the waters. Jared finally glanced at her, his calm gaze unwavering. Morning, he replied evenly. No warmth, no trace of the husband who had once shared her laughter. Angela felt a chill creep up her spine. Trevor appeared moments later, his baseball bag slung over his shoulder. Dad, I'm heading out, he said, pausing only to give her a small, tentative smile. His eyes, however, were sharp, alert. He'd sensed tension too. As the door closed behind Trevor, Angela tried to mask her nerves. What are you working on? She asked, attempting casualness. Nothing you need to worry about, Jared said, his voice deceptively calm. He turned back to the laptop, typing rapidly. Angela's pulse quickened. He was plotting something. She could feel it. Across town, Marcos was blissfully unaware. He lounged in his penthouse suite, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, thinking of the next weekend rendezvous with Angela. He had no idea that Jared had begun pulling threads that would unravel his carefully constructed double life. By mid-morning, the first wave hit. Federal agents arrived at Marcos's office, warrants in hand. Photographers and reporters swarmed outside as investigators cataloged evidence, seizing documents and hard drives. Marcos, blindsided, tried to understand the chaos. Phones rang incessantly, investors demanded explanations, and his employees whispered in disbelief. Meanwhile, Jared's phone buzzed. It was Samantha. Her voice, calm but resolute, reported, divorce papers filed, assets frozen. Marcos is completely caught off guard. We move next. Angela's world started to crumble. She watched Jared from across the room, realizing the web had tightened. Her attempts at manipulation were useless. Every call, every hotel receipt, every message she had thought hidden was already in competent hands. She tried to maintain composure, but a cold dread settled in her chest. She could see it all slipping: the luxury, the plans, the dream life she had hoped to steal. For the first time in months, fear replaced her practiced confidence. Jared's calm presence was like a force field. Not a single outburst, no rage-filled confrontation. Just methodical, precise action, leaving her powerless to intervene. Angela understood, with horrifying clarity, that she had underestimated him. By evening, news alerts confirmed the magnitude of the unfolding disaster. Marcos's assets were frozen, his business under investigation, and legal consequences mounting. Angela sat alone in the penthouse, staring at the city lights below, realizing that every lie she had relied upon was collapsing simultaneously. Jared, at home, finally allowed himself a deep breath. The first dominoes had fallen exactly as planned. He looked at the photos and evidence on his desk, each piece a testament to patience and strategy. The game was far from over, but the tide had turned irreversibly, and Angela and Marcos had nowhere to hide. Angela sat in her penthouse, the city lights below mocking her. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her phone, seeing emails from worried investors, news alerts about federal investigations, and messages from Marcos, panicked and incoherent. Each notification was another reminder that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. She tried calling Marcos, her voice shaking. "We can fix this. Just breathe," she pleaded. But he barely responded, muttering incoherent apologies, consumed by his own panic. Angela realized, for the first time, that he wasn't going to save her. Panic turned to fury. She had always been the one in control, orchestrating events behind the scenes. Yet here she was, powerless, stripped of authority, watching her plans unravel in real time. She slammed her phone down and buried her face in her hands, feeling rage and desperation coalesce into a single, burning determination. She wouldn't go down quietly. Back in Cedar Falls, Jared continued to orchestrate his strategy with meticulous precision. He coordinated with Samantha, ensuring her divorce filing hit at the exact right moment to prevent Marcos from shielding assets. He monitored federal agencies' actions, watching as violations were documented, fines prepared, and legal pressure built. Every action was calculated, measured, designed to maximize consequences for betrayal while protecting his own family. Angela realized she had underestimated Jared in more ways than one. He wasn't just reacting. He was predicting, planning, executing. She tried to recall every conversation, every lie, every subtle gesture that might have hinted at her exposure. The realization that she had left a trail of evidence she couldn't erase made her stomach twist with dread. In a desperate attempt to salvage something, she tried contacting her social circle, reaching out to friends who might provide sympathy or advice. Every call, every message went unanswered. Word had begun to spread, and even her allies were hesitant to intervene. Angela felt herself isolated for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Trevor noticed a shift at home. He watched his father move with calm determination, yet he could sense the storm Angela had brought into their lives. He approached Jared one evening, hesitant. "Dad, is she in trouble?" His voice carried a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jared looked at his son, seeing both the pain and resilience reflected in Trevor's eyes. "Yes," Jared said softly, "but we're handling it. Everything will be all right." He didn't sugarcoat the situation, but he offered reassurance. Trevor nodded, understanding that this wasn't just a family dispute. It was a battle of strategy, patience, and consequences. Angela, in her panic, began to make mistakes. She tried to transfer funds, move assets, and contact lawyers who might bend the law in her favor. Every attempt was intercepted or nullified by Jared's preemptive legal maneuvers. Her panic intensified, her composure eroded, leaving only raw fear and frustration. By the end of the week, Angela's penthouse felt like a cage. She moved through the rooms, haunted by the inevitability of her situation. Every plan she had laid, every lie she had told, was now a trap she could not escape. The luxurious life she had envisioned was collapsing, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Jared, observing from a distance, remained calm. Each misstep Angela made only confirmed the effectiveness of his strategy. He didn't need to raise his voice or explode in anger. The consequences themselves were teaching the lesson Angela had ignored for months. And in that moment, Angela finally understood the depth of her betrayal and the precision of Jared's response. Fear, shame, and helplessness replaced arrogance and manipulation. The game had shifted irrevocably, and she was losing. Angela woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. She groaned, knowing before looking that it was another wave of alerts. Emails from her attorney, notifications from the federal agencies, messages from panicked associates. She tried to push it aside, telling herself she could handle it, but the pit in her stomach had grown into a full-blown ache. She opened the first email and froze. It was from the IRS, confirming that an investigation into Marcos's finances had officially begun. The language was formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Marcos's empire was unraveling. Her pulse quickened as she skimmed the details. Offshore accounts flagged, unpaid taxes, suspicious transfers. All evidence Jared had meticulously gathered and handed over to the authorities. Panic surged. Angela grabbed her phone, dialing Marcos frantically. "Marcos, you have to fix this. You have to stop it." Her voice cracked with desperation. I I can't." Marcos stammered, his voice thin, distant. It's too late. Everything's collapsing." Angela's hands trembled violently. No, no, this can't happen. Not like this." She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her balcony, staring down at the city lights that no longer seemed glamorous but oppressive, mocking. She realized with growing horror that everything she had built, her luxurious life, her plans for the baby, her illusion of control, was disappearing before her eyes. She tried to call her friends, her social connections, anyone who could offer advice or a lifeline. Each call went unanswered. Messages she sent were ignored. Even those who had once sought favor from her now recoiled, sensing the inevitable fallout and not wanting to be associated with her collapse. Isolation, the kind she had never known, began to suffocate her. At home in Cedar Falls, Jared watched the dominoes fall with careful attention. Each federal inquiry, each frozen account, each investor backing out was another confirmation that his strategy was working. He maintained his calm exterior, but internally he cataloged every detail, ensuring that Trevor remained safe, their assets protected, and Angela's plans neutralized. Trevor, sensing the tension but not fully understanding the scope, watched his father quietly. "Dad, is it really over?" he asked one evening, sitting beside Jared on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. Jared put an arm around him, his voice firm yet comforting. "We're not done yet, but we're in control now. Everything we've worked for is safe. You're safe. That's what matters most." Meanwhile, Angela's panic became tangible. She tried to flee the city, hastily booking a flight, but the legal restrictions Jared and Samantha had coordinated prevented any escape. Every move she made was anticipated and countered. Her pride, once so unshakable, was replaced with terror and regret. By midday, Angela received another blow. Her attorney sent word that Samantha Jennings had filed for emergency motions, freezing all assets linked to Marcos and herself. Angela realized the full scope of the trap Jared had set, not just for Marcos, but for her as well. She had played with fire, and now she was burning. Sitting in her penthouse, Angela could no longer ignore the reality. Her dreams of wealth, freedom, and a future with Marcos had crumbled. The baby she had hoped would secure her position was a symbol of her betrayal and failure. She finally understood that manipulation, deceit, and arrogance were powerless against the combination of patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning. Jared, meanwhile, maintained his routine, overseeing projects, guiding Trevor, and communicating with legal and federal authorities. He didn't gloat. The results spoke for themselves. Angela's panic, the collapse of Marcos's empire, and the protection of their family were the ultimate proof that calculated action outweighed raw emotion. That night, Angela sat alone, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, she faced the consequences of her choices directly. The life she had so arrogantly built was gone. The only thing left was reckoning. Angela's phone rang again, a harsh, insistent sound that seemed louder than ever in the quiet of her penthouse. She hesitated, then answered, only to hear Marcos's defeated voice on the other end. They froze everything, he said, his words slurred with disbelief. All the accounts, Angela. Investors pulled out. The projects, the empire, it's gone. Angela's fingers trembled as she gripped the phone tighter. No, no, this can't be happening. Not now. We planned everything. Her voice rose, cracking with desperation. We can still fix this. Marcos let out a hollow laugh, the sound bitter and empty. Fix it? You don't get it. Jared planned it all. Every detail. Every move we made. He anticipated it. We walked right into it. Angela pressed the phone against her forehead, tears spilling down her cheeks. The reality of their failure hit her in waves. The life she had imagined, luxury, power, the new family she thought she'd secure, was disintegrating before her eyes. Every decision, every lie, every secret rendezvous had led to this unrelenting collapse. She threw herself onto the couch, burying her face in the cushions, trying to silence the panic clawing at her chest. Her mind raced. How could she have been so blind? So arrogant? So certain she could control everything and everyone around her? A knock at her door jolted her from the spiral of despair. She froze, heart pounding. The reality she had ignored for so long, the inevitable consequences, was literally at her doorstep. She didn't answer immediately, afraid of what might come next. Another knock, more urgent this time, forced her to look. It was a process server, holding a thick envelope marked in official letters. Angela's hands shook as she took it, eyes scanning the documents inside. Divorce filings, asset freezes, emergency custody motions, and detailed evidence compiled by Jared and Samantha. Her vision blurred. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor. For the first time, Angela understood the full weight of her choices. Every secret, every deceit, every hidden meeting had been meticulously documented, every action anticipated. Jared hadn't reacted in rage. He had outmaneuvered her with precision and patience. He had dismantled her world while protecting his family, leaving her powerless. She could hear Marcos pacing in his penthouse, frantic, trying to salvage something from the ruins. She picked up the phone again. Marcos, it's over. We're trapped. Trapped. His voice trembled. I can't believe this. Everything I built, everything we built. Angela hung up, sinking back into the couch. The penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a gilded cage. She realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. They had underestimated the methodical, intelligent man they had betrayed. The one person whose patience and strategic mind surpassed their own. Hours later, as night fell over the city, Angela sat alone, the documents spread around her like a damning mosaic of failure. The life she had planned with Marcos, the wealth, the freedom, the carefully orchestrated escape, was gone. Every carefully laid plan, every moment of arrogance and betrayal had collapsed. She felt the weight of humiliation, desperation, and loss pressed down on her chest. For the first time, Angela understood that power, manipulation, and charm could never replace integrity, intelligence, and foresight. She was forced to confront the consequences of her actions, powerless to change them, and utterly alone. Meanwhile, Jared sat across town with Trevor, reviewing blueprints for their next major project. Calm, focused, and unshaken, he had ensured their family's security, preserving their life while those who had tried to destroy it faced the full consequences. The contrast was stark, his family safe, thriving, and resilient. Angela and Marcos exposed, unraveling, and powerless. As Angela stared into the night, she understood one final, cruel truth. Betrayal may bring temporary thrill, but strategy, patience, and foresight always win. The reckoning was complete, and she was utterly defeated. Morning came cold and thin, the kind of light that makes everything look sharper and smaller. Jared woke with the same mechanical calm he'd kept for weeks, but there was a new edge to it, less about gathering and more about moving. The preparatory phase had given him the map. Now he needed to walk the route and pull the strings that turned paper into consequence. He started the day at the job site, where the familiar roar of machines and the smell of wet concrete steadied him. Men trusted him here. They knew the cadence of his voice, how a single clear order could turn a confused crew into a flawless operation. He liked that, order from noise. It reminded him that structures can be built and, if necessary, unmade with the right plans. Between meetings, he checked messages. Elena had more press contacts ready. Jeffrey confirmed critical revisions to corporate paperwork, and Paul had scheduled a follow-up to close several gaps in the surveillance timeline. Everything was synchronized to the hour. He replied to no one with more than a single sentence. Precision required containment. Containment required silence. At noon, he met Samantha in a downtown law office, a compact, bright room with a view of the river that looked like a slice of quiet on an otherwise noisy day. Samantha had moved like an engine since the first coffee shop meeting. Calm, focused. She laid out the next legal moves. Targeted subpoenas for Marcos's offshore transfers, emergency petitions to freeze accounts tied to specific LLCs, and steps to secure temporary guardianship should Marcos attempt to vanish. Jared listened and nodded. The language of law felt less like battle and more like engineering to him. Clear inputs producing predictable outputs. Timing, Samantha said, tapping a pen against a document. We hit these nodes simultaneously, and we make escape impossible. We don't turn this into spectacle. We make it a fact pattern. He liked that. He liked the cold clarity of it. Make it a fact pattern, he echoed. That afternoon, he drove to a charity board meeting where Angela was scheduled to speak. It was an elegant gathering. Champagne flutes, floral arrangements, polite applause. He'd told Chuck he might attend, and Chuck had assumed it was because Jared was supporting the cause. The truth was cruder. Jared went to see how Angela performed in public now that the scaffolding around her life was wobbling. Angela stood at the podium in a pale dress, hair pinned neatly, smiling like she always had. But the smile lacked ease. Her eyes flicked to the audience and then to the door, a habit now of someone checking for exits. She spoke with practiced civility about community projects and children's programs. Around her, faces were polite but slightly distant. People distanced themselves from collapsing figures slowly to avoid the spotlight of association. After the applause, she drifted down the reception line like a trader scanning bids. She approached Jared with the calculated warmth she'd used for a decade. "Thank you for coming," she said, close enough for only him to hear. He accepted the handshake and the words, but offered nothing more. The gap between them had grown into a canyon of things unsaid. She tried again. "We should talk, privately." "Not now," he said, soft and final. "Not in public." Her jaw tightened. The moment had the mechanics of a small wound. A glance, a shifted weight. She moved on. Jared watched her smile for the cameras and thought of the confidence with which she'd planned her escape. Confidence is brittle under pressure when the supports are removed. That evening, he traveled to a development site Marcos owned, one of the teased projects that had once been a symbol of swagger. It looked ordinary now. Crew tents shut down, a sign covered with a tarp. He walked the perimeter with the calm observance of a man inspecting his own work, though the landscape belonged to someone else. A foreman recognized him, offering the kind of deference given to experience. Jared asked a few pointed questions about permits and subcontractors, as if curious. The foreman's evasive answers confirmed the holes Paul had uncovered, cut corners patched with cheap work and paper. Back home, he spent 2 hours with the files, stitching a narrative that would be impossible to contest in court or in print. He labeled everything carefully: dates, times, corroborations. Each label was a small hammer blow, making the future's case undeniable. When the set was complete, he sent a single encrypted packet to Elena and Samantha with a line of instruction: release when coordinated. No earlier. Night brought a different kind of strategy. He called a meeting with Chuck and laid out a contingency plan for the business: how to keep cash flow steady, how to reassure clients without airing the private war. Chuck's questions were practical, sharp. "If this gets messy in the press, what's our first move?" he asked. "We keep doing the work right," Jared replied. "We don't answer every provocation. We let the legal system and evidence do the work for us. Our clients respect stability. We give them a reason to stay." Chuck nodded. The plan had the austere elegance of a scaffolding: steady support, no flamboyance. Then he sat for a long time in the dark of his office, the house quiet except for the small noises of night. He thought of Trevor asleep down the hall, innocent in the gravity of this conflict. That innocence was the leverage he would not touch. Everything he did circled back to protecting the boy's life from upheaval. He thought also of Angela, not as an enemy to be obliterated for sport, but as someone who had chosen a road that endangered their family. He felt no pleasure in her ruin. His satisfaction was procedural, a righting of a wrong, calibrated and efficient. The next morning, Paul called with a detail that would test their patience. They're planning to register a new LLC to funnel some movement, Paul said. It's fast. They'll probably do it in the next 48 hours if they think they can hide it. That made the timeline tighter. Then we move earlier, Jared said. We compress the window and force the hand. Compression meant risk, the chance that a small misalignment could let them slip. It also meant opportunity. When the net tightens suddenly, panic reveals mistakes more glaringly. He adjusted their signals. Samantha would file a targeted motion in the morning. Elena would push a focused brief to a trusted reporter in the afternoon. Paul would have shadowing confirmation ready. Everything synchronized meant there was no room to breathe for Marcos and Angela. There would be only moves and countermoves. Before bed, he wrote a short note and left it on Trevor's bedside table. Be at the field tomorrow. I'll bring your glove. It was a small human thing in a day of cold strategy. He kissed the boy's forehead and felt an odd mixture of guilt and resolve. Jared slept like a man who had done as much as he could for the day. The rope he'd begun to tighten around deception felt taut, humming with the potential for final, irreversible sound. The next morning would bring more motion, and the town, already shifting like sand under a tide, would feel the first true wrestle between private betrayal and public consequence. Jared spent the early morning hours reviewing every detail Paul had meticulously gathered over weeks of quiet observation. Each photograph, every hotel receipt, every exchanged text message and social media post was cataloged, dated, and cross-referenced. Nothing was left to chance. The slightest misstep could ruin everything he had worked for. Trevor lay curled under his blanket upstairs, unaware of the storm that was quietly gathering around them. Jared lingered at the doorway for a long moment, watching his son's peaceful sleep. The sight filled him with a bitter sense of irony, innocence and trust, so easily shattered by a single betrayal. One night of indiscretion had threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Angela moved softly through the kitchen, humming a familiar tune as she prepared coffee, oblivious to the meticulous orchestration taking place under her roof. To her, the morning was ordinary, mundane even. But Jared's mind was a battlefield, every thought a strategic move, every breath calculated. He sat at the kitchen table, reviewing his plan one last time. Emails to federal agencies were drafted, tip lines carefully composed, legal documents aligned in perfect order. The calmness he projected wasn't mere serenity, it was his weapon. No yelling, no accusations, just the quiet inevitability that would collapse deception without warning. Every movement was deliberate. The way he poured his coffee, the pause before sitting, even the glance toward Angela as she moved across the room. It was a silent message. He was ready. By the end of this day, nothing would remain as it was. At precisely 7 a.m., Jared began executing the first phase of his plan. He made the call to the Environmental Protection Agency, his voice steady, measured, authoritative. He relayed the detailed evidence of Marcos Jennings' violations, illegal dumping, falsified reports, unsafe practices. The information was undeniable, the delivery impeccable. Next, he contacted the IRS tip line, providing every shred of financial impropriety he had uncovered. Offshore accounts, misreported income, and suspicious deductions that painted a clear picture of corporate fraud. Each fact was laid out with precision, each word carefully chosen to ensure immediate investigation. Angela moved through the house, oblivious. She chopped vegetables for breakfast, her laughter light and airy, completely unaware of the legal and federal machinery Jared had set in motion. He spoke in neutral tones, discussing mundane topics like the morning news and errands, hiding the storm he had unleashed behind a mask of calm. By midday, Jared coordinated a confidential meeting with Samantha Jennings. Handing her the evidence of Marcos's affairs, he explained with clarity how she could protect herself and her daughters. Samantha's initial shock was quickly replaced with determined action, filing emergency documents that would immobilize Marcos's financial and legal freedom. Jared watched quietly, knowing that each domino was falling exactly where he intended. He didn't rush, didn't celebrate. The damage was meticulous, precise, and irreversible. By evening, the consequences of Jared's carefully orchestrated plan became undeniable. Federal agents descended on Marcos's offices, freezing accounts, seizing records, and launching criminal investigations. Every investor and partner began to withdraw, hesitant to be associated with the unraveling scandal. The empire Marcos had spent years constructing began to crumble. Angela noticed first subtle signs: the phone constantly ringing, emails flooding her inbox, unexpected visitors asking questions she couldn't answer. Her confident composure began to crack. Panic seeped into her movements, her carefully rehearsed calm replaced by an almost primal fear. She tried to dismiss the signs, to rationalize them, but each new message and visit reinforced the reality she had tried to ignore. The life she had meticulously planned, luxury, escape, freedom, was collapsing around her. Jared remained silent, observing, analyzing. He didn't gloat, but allowed himself a quiet sense of satisfaction. Years of careful planning and unwavering focus were bearing fruit. His patience, his strategy, and his resolve had dismantled the deceit piece by piece, leaving no room for escape. That night, Jared finally confronted Angela. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. His calmness carried a terrifying authority. Piece by piece, he presented the evidence: photos, receipts, emails, and messages, each fact immovable, undeniable. The truth laid bare itself like a mirror she could not look away from. Angela's initial defiance crumbled. Her excuses, pleas, and manipulations were futile against cold, documented reality. Each lie she had relied upon was met with irrefutable proof. She realized, with growing dread, that control was no longer hers. The world she had manipulated for her convenience was gone. Trevor slept upstairs, protected from the chaos, but learning, in the quiet intensity of his father's actions, the lessons of patience, strategy, and the consequences of betrayal. Jared's calm dominance was a silent lecture, more powerful than anger ever could have been. In the following weeks, Jared focused on rebuilding what Angela and Marcos had attempted to destroy. The divorce was swift, the prenuptial agreement and evidence of her betrayal, ensuring minimal financial fallout for him. Marcos faced prison, financial ruin, and a public spectacle that dismantled his carefully crafted image. Jared's attention turned to Trevor, whose trust and admiration deepened through shared projects, honest conversation, and the quiet stability his father provided. Business thrived as Jared applied his methodical mind, integrity, and unwavering determination to every client and project. Angela faced the consequences of her actions with reluctant humility. She worked long hours at part-time jobs, stripped of luxury, forced to confront the reality she had evaded for so long. It was a slow, humbling, inescapable reckoning, a direct result of her choices. 3 years later, Jared had found love again, with Pearl Downing, whose honesty, patience, and integrity mirrored his own. Their relationship grew deliberately, without shadows, built on trust and shared values. Atkinson Construction expanded, a monument to resilience, skill, and uncompromising ethics. Trevor had become a thoughtful, responsible young man, shaped not by betrayal but by the measured wisdom and strategic patience of his father. Angela and Marcos had faded from their lives, reduced to cautionary tales of greed, infidelity, and hubris. Jared reflected on the past with clarity rather than bitterness. The betrayal had been devastating, yet it had forged a life stronger, purer, and more resilient. He realized that while deception could destroy, careful action, patience, and intelligence could rebuild and triumph. The ultrasound that had once symbolized lies and fear now represented a turning point, a painful but necessary moment that catalyzed truth, justice, and a life rebuilt on foundations stronger than any wall, stronger than any deception.